Everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. Just really quickly, I want to provide some context on regarding why we're doing this particular webinar. For most students, I think that as they enter the application process or even begin thinking about applying to university, many of them think about how do I position myself to be the best person? How do I sound impressive when it comes to applying to university and specifically sharing your story through essays and other parts of the application itself? But I think that one thing to note is that this session is not about writing tricks, it's not about sounding impressive. It's more so about understanding how universities try to make sense of students and how students often make it harder to a certain extent than what it needs to be. I think that the writing process becomes a lot easier as a student when you lean into your authentic voice and really understand what the message is that you'd like to share with universities. So for students, I'd say that the purpose of this particular webinar is around clarity. And if you are a parent joining today, I think as an advocate for your child or as someone who will support them through the entire process, this is about understanding what actually matters beneath the surface. And so this then becomes an anchor for how we will approach today's session. So just a quick background of myself. I've been working in university access or university guidance for quite a number of years now. I've worked both at a university as well as at different high schools across the globe and in different countries as well. And so for me, this is really a part of what the work that I'm passionate about, helping students try to share their particular stories. From a personal perspective, my background is actually in English literature. And so the writing part of this and helping students understand who they are, the careers they hope to get into, and then finally putting that into words and articulating it through their applications, that becomes really important for me. And so just to get us started, I think it is important to note and to think about what do universities want to understand through the written components of an application. And so, for many students, as they go through the process of getting ready for university applications in the ninth grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, they oftentimes focus a lot of their energy on trying to do as much as possible. So, what activities are going to make me stand out? How do I really show that I'm impressive both academically but also outside of the classroom? And those are important aspects. But something to note is that you won't get admitted to a university because you have something impressive on your activity list. It's about how that activity has really transformed you as a person. And so, what I really want to highlight here is that universities admit people. They approach this particular process from trying to understand what is the cohort we would like to see in the University of Oxford's class of 2027 or Harvard University's class of 2027. Who are the people who are going to make up this particular cohort? And what does that identity or environment feel like? And so they are searching for people who are curious, intellectually, socially, emotionally. Are you able to engage with yourself and with others on various levels? Is there a direction that you're clearly articulating through the narrative that you're sharing in terms of your genesis as a person? As someone who might be interested in economics from an early age, how are you able to make sense of what economics means to you at grade 9 versus at grade 11? And are you bringing complexity and intensity to the work that you're doing? And so, what your story should be revealing at any given moment through various parts of the application is growth, you as a student, but also as a person, intentionality that really comes from are you being specific in the decisions that you're making, or are you just trying to be really broad and trying to do the most impressive things, doing a summer research project that is not necessarily aligned with who you are and what you hope to do? And then finally, they're also trying to understand through your story what is the potential impact that you'll make on the world. And this particular part, I think, is oftentimes misunderstood by many students and perhaps even families as you're guiding your child through this particular process. When you apply to a university, one of the first things that you'll see is the mission or the vision of the university. Oftentimes, it can also be seen in the motto of a particular institution. And you'll find that many universities will share mottos that speak to cultivating people who are going to be a light on the world, people who are going to make a difference, who are not afraid of change and discomfort. And so those are hints into how the university might understand and experience impact and what they are looking for in students. So that potential to be a light, to sit with discomfort, to make difficult changes. That is what they're looking for. And so, one question you should be asking yourself is, as I'm preparing to apply to university, what are the experiences and activities that I've engaged in that shows my ability to have that type of impact on a personal level, but also on a global level? And when I say global, I don't only mean geopolitically or in geographical terms, but global impact, meaning that what you do is going to spur on change in others as well. So those then become really integral parts in anchoring the narrative that you should be thinking about from a young age. And there's also a difference between a list and a story. And I think that oftentimes we can be so consumed by lists. If you think about how students are preparing for their portfolios, it's about bullet points and trying to get everything neat and structured and categorized. But those categories only make sense and have a clear impact when they're tied into a narrative. And so, as an applicant, you can have a lot of achievements, but if you're not able to take those achievements and contextualize them to who you are as a person and who you see yourself becoming, then it's less impactful. And this is something that I really want to drive home today. This idea that your story should be able to take different parts of you and put them together in order to create a holistic image and view of who you are as a person. And so a list, as I've put in here, tells the university, here are my tasks. These are things that I've done as a checklist. A story, on the other hand, shows the trajectory of your thinking. And I just want you to sit with that for a little bit. And you can take maybe 30 seconds to reflect on activities that you're currently engaged in. How do those activities show the trajectory of your thinking? So just for a little while, think about it. And if you are able to draw a through line from one activity to the next and see how it develops in depth, then you're on the right path. If you are finding that a lot of the tasks and activities that you're doing are very disparate because they are more of a checklist than a story, now is the time for you to think about, how do I reorganize my life and my interests in order to really highlight what I'm passionate about and curious about moving forward. And then this is what will make your application stand out to a university as they're reading it. Something else that's really important to note for many students is that universities will receive tens of thousands of applications for 1,000 seats. At some universities, they'll receive tens and thousands of applications for just 400 seats in a first year class. And in order to stand out, you need to have a narrative that resonates with the reader. And the only way that you are able to resonate with the reader is to keep in mind that the person reading the application is a human being. Of course, there are certain cutoffs that you'll need to be aware of, like, for example, a GPA or an SAT score or other standardized tests. Perhaps there are certain activities that you feel are integral to who you are as a person, and those aspects are important. But I think that a step further, moving from that idea of having a list to making it impactful, is to still drive this idea that you are a human being entering into the application process. And so I want to chat with you all today about how do you actually begin thinking about the narrative? Oftentimes, as well, when I, as a counselor, specifically in my early years of counseling, and I would tell students, your story needs to be unique, your narrative needs to be unique. And they would stop, and I would see a lot of fear and anxiety in their eyes. And I think that the word unique oftentimes leads students into thinking that it needs to be something dramatic. It leads them to think that the narrative that they're sharing with universities needs to be something that is overly emotional or traumatic, even at times. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. The narrative needs to be coherent. And so there are five segments, as I've been doing research and refining my own practices as a counselor, that I share with students. The five segments are that there needs to be a spark. The spark needs to lead to a pattern, and that pattern can be behaviors, it can be activities that you participate in, it could be the courses that you're selecting to do at high school or even outside of the classroom. It also needs to have a question. What is the question that you're trying to resolve? Is there a problem that you're trying to solve? Is there a theoretical idea that you're trying to understand more deeply? Is there a personal experience that you're trying to make sense of? And so the question itself needs to have a level of curiosity and openness because it's oftentimes this that leads universities to understand that as an intellectual person, you're able to enter into discourse and dialogue on various different things, and that's what makes you a well-rounded person for a particular university. There also needs to be a commitment, and so how are you committing to doing the things you say are important to you? And finally, the horizon. Where's this taking you to? How is it enabling you to evolve as a person, as a student, as someone interested in a particular topic? And this then serves as the structure of how you will be moving forward with evidence of how you've already moved from point A to point B, and that point C is going to be the university aspect of it and your growth during that. And so we'll dive a little bit more deeply into what I mean by each of these. And so the spark, again, is this beginning moment. What are you curious about? It could be an ordinary moment, something that maybe enabled a light bulb to go off in your head. I remember working with a student once, and their spark actually came from watching football with their father. And they were deep in conversation about the match statistics as well as how could they potentially predict who the winner was going to be. And this student was really interested and had a passion for maths. And so this spark became, okay, if I'm able to assess the outcomes of games historically, how can I then use that as a predictor for future data and future outcomes? And so the spark was an ordinary moment of just watching football on the TV with their dad. And it might be, again, a challenge, a problem, or even an observation. I think what matters here is that it is authentic. And when I say that authenticity matters, the spark should show and really highlight your thinking process. Authenticity is also sometimes a scary word where students say, but I don't know what is really authentic. And I will always say to them, go back to what is uniquely yours. And what's uniquely yours as a student is your perspective. And the way that you view something is never going to be the same way that someone else views it because you've grown up in a particular context, you've experienced a particular type of education, you've engaged in certain conversations with family and friends. And so that position that you find yourself in is going to give you a perspective and lean into that when thinking about authenticity. It's not about creating something that is completely unique or an idea that no one has ever thought of, but it's how you view it. And so I leave you with this particular part right at the bottom on the spark is that great stories begin quietly. And that is something that I do want you to keep in mind as you go through the process of ideating and writing your essays and thinking about strategically the overall narrative that you hope to share with universities. And so now we move on to the pattern. And so the spark is not a phase, it is a moment. How do you then show that this moment had an impact on you because you were saying that it is important to you as a student and as a person? How are you engaging with it regularly? And so, my takeaway from this, again, when speaking with different university reps, etc., is that they trust repeated choices. I've worked with students in the past that have a different activity each year of their high school career. And one of the challenges with that is that as a reader, as a university rep, it becomes really difficult to understand what you are truly interested in. If you're moving from robotics club in grade 9 to the finance club in grade 10 to drama in grade 11, these are all great individually, but how do they tell a story? And so if you are able to show that the decisions you're making year in and year out are linked because you are really passionate about something, that then reads really well. It's not to say that you shouldn't have diversity in the activities or the courses that you take. That is really important. But there should be certain choices that you have depth in. And so depth is demonstrated through repeated choices. And these patterns are not isolated moments, as I've shared on the slide, they are evidence. And so, again, I just want you to think to yourself and maybe write this particular question down. What do I keep returning to, even when it's not required of me? And I think that this is a really important question. And I'll share an anecdote from my personal experiences. In high school, I was really good at STEM subjects. In particular, I loved maths, I loved accounting. And so I thought that I was going to go into finance. It's something that I was skilled in, but I didn't necessarily have a passion for it because the education system that I schooled in oftentimes directed students to focus on if you're good at maths and science, do maths and science. There was no encouragement of trying things that were not necessarily comfortable or perhaps seen as worthy of studying at the high school level. And so, as I was developing as a college student, thankfully, I went to a liberal arts college that allowed me to explore different disciplines. I kept returning to this idea of people, humanities, social sciences, politics, literature, and literature became this huge feature for me, where I oftentimes, when trying to understand complex human systems, I'd return to books, to novels, to articles in order to understand the real world better. And so for me, the pattern that I saw emerging, if I were to reflect on my university days, was that I was much more interested in the mechanics, so to speak, of life and how literature enabled me to understand these complex systems a lot better through narratives. And so that then led to me taking different courses within literature, etc. And it just built on from there. And so clearly, there is a way in which I was able to tell a particular narrative through the decisions that I was making. And those decisions lead to the question, what is the intellectual itch that drives you? And what we mean here is that there is something that constantly comes back. It's not about being good in a particular subject. It's not about necessarily being fluent in a particular topic. It's more so about what gets you staying up at night or what pushes you to read beyond what is required. Okay. Reading or experimentation or simulations or doing something entrepreneurial. What is that question that you're trying to solve that constantly makes you lose track of time and just really comes up to a genuine passion? And this question, to a large extent, becomes an anchor to your academic identity. And I want to make a point here that your academic identity is not static. It moves, it changes, it builds, it grows in ways that sometimes you may not understand as a high school student. But for now, focusing on the thing that you really turn to constantly, perhaps it's AI, perhaps it's technology, or it could be environmental science and the climate crisis. If it is something that keeps you going, something that you don't mind reading a book about, this is potentially how you are able to find that intellectual itch. It's not a process of saying what is going to sound impressive or make me stand out in a university application. It's returning to that idea of authenticity and saying, what do I find myself returning to constantly? And this then becomes a really important part of your academic identity. And once you're able to understand that intellectual itch, how do you then commit yourself to it? And this should be something that you can demonstrate through the application itself. So your commitment is the point where interest demanded effort. Are you willing to spend an entire summer break doing research on this particular question? That then shows commitment to it. Are you able to take a class outside of what is offered at your current high school? For many students who are interested in, let's say, law, or they may be interested in finance and investment banking, those aren't necessarily subjects you can take in school, but perhaps you then start a finance club at your school. And through the finance club, you can focus on how to invest money from learning alongside your peers to perhaps at some stage going to the school administration and saying, we'd like to formally build an investment club and run something that is tangible. And so that shows your initiative as a student. It shows resilience because a lot of these projects aren't easy. You need to become comfortable with failure. And I think that this is something that many students don't often understand, or if they fail once, they quickly shift gears or go to a different topic or go to a different subject. But if you're able to continue through and develop something that is meaningful to you, that highlights your resilience. And so, right now, I'd like you to think about if you are in grade 11, ask yourself, have I developed a project that is uniquely tied to what I am interested in as a person? And have I grown through this particular project that I've done? If you don't have a project, I think that there's still sufficient time for you to think about how can I really show this depth of both my intellectual and academic curiosities, but also the depth of my character, how I'm able to develop something despite challenges and obstacles and boundaries that I am experiencing. And this is what makes your narrative credible. Evidence is important. So while at the beginning of the session I said that lists don't tell a story, this is where those lists do come into play. Are you able to write down what you've done, how you've done it, and what the impact of that was through your journey? Because the evidence is what makes the entire narrative credible. Any student can come and say, I'm really passionate about environmental science because I think that the climate crisis is something that is really going to be to the detriment of humanity. And if that particular student is so passionate about it, but they've never done anything related to it, it makes the university question whether or not this is performative. And so the authenticity can also be shown through what you do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And so the practices that you have, the habits that you develop, can speak to these particular passions that you are sharing in the narrative. And then finally, universities think about their institutions as a launch pad. Your undergraduate education, or your graduate education for that matter, is not the final or end point to who you are becoming as a person. It is a step toward your becoming. And so the admissions readers want to see where are you moving toward? they get a glimpse of who you are becoming and how that may fit into the university. As a university, they'd be asking themselves, do we have the courses and academic program that is going to fit Mr. Dexter? Or do we have the resources outside of the classroom to ensure that Mr. Dexter, who's really interested in entrepreneurship from a development economics standpoint, yes, we offer development economics, but are we able to help him ideate and incubate some of the thoughts and solutions he has to problems that his community is experiencing? And if the answer to that is yes, they are more likely to admit you to the university because they can then understand how they form a part of your story as an individual. And again, this is not something that is fixed, it is not static. Rather, it is something that constantly moves and changes because at 16 or 17, no one is expecting you to know what your life is going to look like at 35 or 40. I can definitely share that my 16 and 17-year-old self could never imagine the both the job that I'm currently doing, but also who I am intellectually and some of the interests that I have outside of work as well. However, it needs to be intentional. Are you testing things out to really understand who you are becoming? Are you testing it out because you are trying to understand from an intellectual perspective what keeps you up at night? And perhaps more importantly, it's around that community as well as that personal side of things. How is this helping you evolve and build your character over time? These are all important questions that universities try to see in the narrative that you share. And also, I think that at this particular moment of the presentation, many students forget that the core part of what you control as a student is your essay, your activity list, but that is not controlled in a performative sense. It's rather, if you have the time to develop that over time, think about how you would like to be perceived by others. And that perception should really speak to the intentionality of what you want to do in your academic life, in your careers, in your personal life, and how that lends itself to being a global citizen as well as someone who is invested in the idea of impact. And so, what does passion actually look like? So, it's great that we have the spine and the structure on how we can build the narrative over time and really speak to the people who we are becoming. Passion is not just being excited about something or being enthusiastic about something. It's also part of the choices that you make on a regular basis when no one is watching, that is really, really critical to this. I oftentimes think about this idea of passion in the past as I've coached students who are, let's say, applying to the University of Oxford, where the interviews for admission, they're really based on your knowledge and expertise in a particular subject. And what I've realized over time is that the students who are successful into getting into universities like Oxford and Cambridge, for example, are the students who will go above and beyond to explore their interests when no one is watching. They are the ones who are creating blogs and writing about subjects that are important to them as individuals. They are the ones who are participating in competitions, even when there aren't any competitions offered at their respective schools. And so, how are you as a student spending your free time? Is it free time just to watch Netflix and you're only invested in learning about biology when it's biology class or a specific assignment? Or are you the person who is constantly going in to understand genes and genomes and extending your learning in ways? And so, again, we go to this idea of asking yourself, what behaviors do I repeat? What environments allow me to thrive? Which values keep showing up in my decisions? And these are all linked because your behaviors are going to speak to your values, and your values might also drive your behaviors. In addition to that, when speaking about the environment, how are you collaborating with others? That may also help you decide on the type of university that you'll eventually attend. And so these are all important parts to understand that it doesn't only show up in your essay, but rather in various parts of the application itself. The experience audit is also something that I love doing with students. So once you come to the realization that daily practices and decisions that you make when no one is watching, how you spend your free time, how you engage with others, the conversations you have with your family, or perhaps even the conversations you have with your friends, this then becomes really important when thinking about how do I experience life? And it seems like it's not that revolutionary, but oftentimes we only like sharing the most impressive parts of ourselves that we can say, I did a summer program at X, Y, and Z university. I did research through this particular research program. Again, those are all important, but what do you do on a daily basis and what does that say about you? And so we can look at this from four different lenses. The first one is action, what you actually did. What do you do on a regular day? What are the problems or obstacles that you've met when thinking about these particular topics, or perhaps outside of that? What are general problems and obstacles that you've experienced that have just pushed you to be better as a person? The shift then comes in. What did you learn through these challenges? And that becomes really important when explaining to universities how you've evolved as a student, as a human being. And then finally, that evolution should be demonstrated through the growth in the later decisions that you make. So, decisions that you make in terms of your activities, decisions that you make in terms of your major or your career, those are all really important because it moves from saying that you've just done a particular activity to focusing on how the activity, how the experience has changed you fundamentally, both as an academic, as a student, as a person. And that becomes really important. And those experiences are intricately linked to your academic identity. So your story becomes a lot more powerful when the experiences that you have or that you show point to an academic direction. And so a strong academic identity includes the question, the fields, the proof, the reason. And for the intent of this particular presentation, I think that the reason is really what I want you to focus on. The reason is important because as you engage in different opportunities, in different activities, in different learning experiences, how does that shape your thinking about a particular subject? And how does that change in your own thinking then speak to what you'd like to do in the future? One example of this from very recently with a student that I've worked with was that this student was really passionate about fintech. And as a high school student, there are limited opportunities to learn about fintech. They may be doing computer science, they may be doing economics, but bringing those ideas together don't always seamlessly happen in the classroom. And so, as someone interested in fintech at a boarding school, how do you then really show how these attributes, these interests, these passions that you have, how do they point to where you want to go to? And so, what the student did was thinking about the ecosystem at the high school that I taught at. They thought about how can I develop an app that includes certain aspects of fintech, but more importantly, solves a particular problem. So, they try to answer a question. And one of the problems that they saw was that the school that I was working at had a cashless system, but the cashless system was quite challenging for many of the students at that particular high school. And so they then decided to, instead of a cashless system that required a card, how can I develop an app that utilizes the existing infrastructure and that could seamlessly be built into the school's ecosystem. And that then became a major project for the student in their final year of high school. It was also an anchor for them in the application. The student then went on to university, and at this particular university, they had double majored in computer science and finance, and did a lot of work with the entrepreneurship center at this particular university. And currently, they are living and working in San Francisco developing fintech apps. And so you could clearly see how the students question that they asked, the fields that they explored, the proof of that through developing an app and ideating and testing led them into that future that they envisioned for themselves and that the university could see through their daily activities and practices. That then becomes really important. And so to put this into practice, for some of you on this particular call, you may say to yourself, I really want to study economics. But when thinking about economics, it's such a vast discipline. So within your current capacity and where you are as a 15, 16, 17-year-old, how do you approach this from something that might be impactful within means? So moving from saying, I want to study economics, let's break it down into something that is a lot more specific. You could, for example, think through this and say, I want to understand how informal markets in Bangkok scale trust without regulation and how that knowledge could strengthen entrepreneurial ecosystems across Southeast Asia. And so that was a mouthful, but I think what's really important here is that you're able to see how a student is not thinking about economics in a global sense, but bringing it down to the local level, where they're focusing on informal markets in a specific city, how and that they're interested in the component of trust in economics and financial systems, and how could that then strengthen the entrepreneurial ecosystem? And so there's a clear through line on how the student is thinking. And so not saying I'm only interested in macroeconomics, but they're thinking about all of these specific questions and a particular part of economics. And so this then becomes a statement that they could use when doing research. They could utilize this as a personal project and perhaps getting other people to participate in an entrepreneurial venture together in their home city. And so this, I think, is a lot more meaningful to you as a student when trying to understand which direction you're taking, but also as a signpost or a signal to universities on what you are really interested in as a student. And so now we move into, after understanding all of these different intricacies around the narrative that you're sharing from a very academic standpoint, it is also important for me to highlight certain mistakes that students oftentimes commit when writing their essays or thinking about the overall narrative they'd like to share. I've definitely worked with students who have, again, shared a lot of experiences that were very traumatic to them. And if you have experienced something that is quote unquote traumatic or difficult as a student, my advice is to always think about how are you showing your growth through it and not just taking the negative experience and sharing that as this is who I am, because who you are is greater than that singular experience. And so trauma without agency is oftentimes a mistake that students make that really erase their identity from the essay. Overconfidence is similarly something that you should be avoiding when writing your essays and telling the overall story of who you are. Overconfidence without evidence is, as I've mentioned before, the evidence becomes a part of credibility to the story that you're sharing. A CV disguised as prose, the essay, any sort of story that you're sharing, even in an interview, should not be a list of things you've done, but rather think about what are the most important parts in my experience thus far that should be highlighted in an essay. Performance of passion rather than truth. This goes back to the idea of authenticity, an adult voice. Oftentimes I've also worked with students who have relied so much on what other people have said to them or other people's perceptions of who they are that they begin to lose their voice in the essay. It could also come from over editing, having your teachers or your parents or a counselor overly edit your essay to sound impressive is going to lose your authentic voice. It's going to make it sound like an essay that's not really coming from a 17-year-old student from, let's say, Vietnam. Let your identity shine through the words you use and the way that you speak. If, as a reader, I'm reading an essay that you've written, I want that essay to reflect our regular interactions. Yes, there's going to be a certain level of sophistication in the essay or the written version, but it should still sound like you. I should be able to identify that this is Mint's essay through our regular engagements. And then finally, we oftentimes find that essays end on a moral lesson that is just put right at the end, and that's not really reflection. Reflection happens at various points in your writing because as a human being, you don't just reflect at the end of your life. And this is a habit that I hope that all of you begin adopting if you don't do it already, but reflect regularly, reflect intentionally, because if you're able to make sense of your experiences as you are experiencing them or going through those particular moments, I think that it enables you to build a lot greater intentionality in the next decision that you're making. And so think about it in the same way when writing an essay or the overall structure of the narrative that you're sharing with universities. Don't let it be a moral lesson, but let it rather be a process of change, a process of understanding. And so that reflection then becomes really important and not a summary of what you believe a university wants to see. And this then leads into the idea of originality, that authenticity. Original stories aren't loud, they are specific. Universities only remember students who are really thinking about, how do these things actually work? I'm not really interested in the theory of an experiment, but the process of doing an experiment. You break and you rebuild the school's library barcode system. That then becomes really, really important and integral because it's showing the level of commitment that you are going through as a high school student. And so that deep thinking, something simple can be really meaningful. I remember an essay that still stands out to me till today of a student who wrote about the act of brushing their teeth in the morning and how that forms part of a ritual. And so the mundane, really just such a unique story, something that oftentimes we may not think about as powerful, really revealed something important about the student as well as how they think and approach life. And so nothing is too small. If you're able to make meaning out of something, share that. That becomes really important. And so we've talked about this idea of narrative, we've talked about essays, we've talked about activity lists. How do they all come together? And so this is not a definitive list or approach to how to think about how these things tie together. But something that I do want you to just consider and reflect on is that the personal essay could show your identity as well as your motivation. And that could be identity in a specific subject or field, identity broadly speaking. If you're not talking about your academics, perhaps it is something that is related to who you are and how you see the world, as well as motivation. What motivates you to continue developing, growing, and that future vision that we talked about as well. Supplementary essays can link to depth. So, how have you gone deep into specific subjects, not just holding breath, but going deep into the specifics, ideas, etc., as well as academic fit? What are you, again, thinking about when no one else is looking, and how are you pushing yourself to approach some of the questions that seem really challenging at a particular point? The activity list provides the evidence as well as progress. So, for example, playing tennis in your first year of high school, but then moving into being a captain in your senior year, that is showing how you've grown in a particular sport. The recommendation letters that your counselor will be writing, as well as teachers or certain mentors, they will show external confirmation that is further evidence to who you are as a person from someone else's perspective. And then finally, interviews being this idea of self-awareness, coherence. Are you able to take all of these different parts of you as a student and put it into a narrative? Not one essay, but a narrative that is in various parts of your application. And I think that even if you aren't applying to university right away, you can utilize this particular framework when thinking about the decisions that you'll be making moving forward. And this becomes really important if you are in grade 10 or if you are in grade 11, because you can start seriously thinking about how do I make sense of what I've done and how have these particular activities and experiences shaped me as a person. That reflective exercise of thinking through these questions and multiple different points, I believe, will enable you to have a really strong application from the aspect of what you control as a student. And so, a final message on today's webinar is that the university application is not a performance, it is a crafted portrait. And you have time to craft that particular portrait of how your mind works, what you're curious about, be specific, be authentic and honest, and also be intentional. Hopefully, each one of you on today's webinar have a mentor or counselor who you could have a conversation with about how your portrait is shaping up at this moment in time, so that it is not solely focused on what is most impressive, but how the narrative reflects who you are, because who you are is impressive. And so that's what makes a story compelling and really enables you to resonate with an admission reader. And so thank you all so much for joining today's webinar. I'd be open to taking some questions if there's time. So Mint, thank you so much.